Did the WSPU militant campaign help or hinder the cause of women's suffrage? In the short term, militant tactics achieved their aim of raising both the profile of the cause and the WSPU. As Emmeline Pankhurst said, "You have to make more noise than anybody else. You have to make yourself more obtrusive than anybody else. You have to fill the papers more than anybody else." In the summer of 1905, the union still had only 30 members. However, after Christabel Pankhurst's much publicised arrest for spitting at a policeman removing her from a Liberal Party rally and the subsequent acts of militancy, membership surged. By February 1907, the WSPU had 47 branches and 9 paid organisers. By 1910, its income and paid staff exceeded that of the Labour Party, and its magazine, Votes for Women, had a circulation of about 40,000 copies a week. Estimates as to the peak WSPU membership vary enormously, but most tend to put it in the 2,000 to 5,000 range. The surge in WSPU membership also boosted the membership of the peaceful National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. In part, the NUWSS simply became more actively engaged in recruitment to see off its competitor, but the rising fortunes were also a reflection of the growing interest in the cause that the publicity Suffragette militant acts generated. Membership of the NUWSS grew from 12,000 in 1909 to a staggering 50,000 by 1914. However, despite this, Millicent Fawcett, president of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, denounced the militants as the chief obstacles in the way of the success of the suffrage movement. For Fawcett and other prominent suffragists, the militant tactics of the WSPU were undermining their efforts to build a consensus in Parliament to back a women's suffrage bill. It is true that the later violent militant campaign was a gift to anti-suffragists, just at a time when they appeared to be losing the argument in Parliament from 1912 onward. As the suffragettes' militant acts turned increasingly to arson and planting bombs, questions in Parliament focused less on the pros and cons of women's suffrage and more on how to deal with suffragette outrages. Parliamentary support for women's suffrage also looked to be ebbing away as pillar boxes burnt and new bombs were discovered. 34 of the MPs who voted for the 1911 Conciliation Bill changed their mind and voted against the 1912 bill. A further 70 former supporters abstained. Bills supporting women's suffrage in 1897, 1904, 1908 and 1911 had all achieved majorities, only failing for want of parliamentary time. But in 1912 the Conciliation Bill was defeated, and another women's suffrage bill in 1913 was rejected by an even higher margin. Similarly, Conservative Party conferences in 1912 and 1913 voted down resolutions in support of women's suffrage, despite having supported them on 6 prior occasions. Meanwhile, on the left, working-class men also seemed to be alienated by the actions of the suffragettes. When George Lansbury, a pro-women's suffrage Labour MP, resigned his seat to fight a by-election on the issue of women's suffrage, his majority evaporated and he lost his seat to a Conservative. Not only that, a not insignificant number of WSPU members left the organisation in response to the escalation of militancy, and by 1914 the organisation looked to be in trouble. The number of new recruits was down, and police raids, the seizure of funds and records, and the arrest of key staff, all in response to the escalating violence, left the organisation reeling. Worse still, the organisation was running out of funds, with distribution of its magazine, The Suffragette, restricted, and its access to parks and most meeting halls prohibited. 2 of its key sources of income were severely reduced. Emmeline Pankhurst was forced to make fresh appeals for funds, but even when donations were sent, they risked being seized by the police, who were intercepting mail sent to the WSPU headquarters. Finally, the militant campaign was taking its toll on the activists themselves. Imprisonment, hunger strikes and forced feeding left many in poor health. Returning to Westminster, when Sylvia Pankhurst's delegation of East London Federation of Suffragettes met Herbert Asquith in June 1914, the Prime Minister agreed that some formula of women's suffrage would be added to a wider package of electoral reform. However, this was conditional on the militant campaign ceasing. When this was communicated to Christabel Pankhurst, she and Emmeline refused to cease the campaign, perhaps understandably not trusting the word of the Prime Minister after so many failed women's suffrage bills. And so the question remained deadlocked, and would remain so until the outbreak of the First World War. Militancy may have been successful in attracting public attention, but it never won the suffragettes' wider public support. This was no miscalculation on the part of the WSPU. The Pankhursts were not trying to win a popularity contest. Their clearly stated aim was to force the government's hand, not change its heart or appeal to its head. The Pankhursts believed that the government would have to back down in order to restore public order and to protect property. Where they had arguably miscalculated was in underestimating the electoral dimension to Asquith's government's reluctance to support a women's suffrage bill. To enfranchise women on equal terms as men prior to 1918, without at the same time extending the vote to more men, as the WSPU demanded, would have enfranchised what the Liberals feared would be a large number of female Conservative voters. The result was an impasse. As Bob Whitfield writes, in escalating their militant campaign, the WSPU offended virtually all the allies on whom their success ultimately depended.